speakers. We are welcoming you to our next Art in Conversation seminar on synesthesia, and this time is going to be on olfaction and perfumery. This gathering is special not because of our geographical distribution, but also because we're honored and delighted to host three stellar speakers coming from the most intense practice and research into synesthesia and cross-model correspondences in olfaction. Our first speaker, as we've agreed, is an internationally acclaimed olfactive expert, co-founder and creative director of 1229, a New York-based fragrance design company. Dawn Goldworm. Dawn has a background in fragrance chemistry and years of training and research, along with her work at Avon and Coty Beauty. Dawn has a rare ability of synesthesia, and with her extensive knowledge of scent memory, she has worked with various luxury fashion brands, hotels, high-profile retail spaces, and individuals. They all seek to craft custom signature scents, olfactive branding, and scented experience for more efficient customer engagement. Dawn and her sister and business partner, Samantha Goldworm, have elevated the role of scent in the world of branding and design. The Goldworm sisters are co-founders of the Scent for Good Foundation, a charity that gives access to education and resources for girls in lower-income neighborhoods. Dawn Goldworm is also an olfactory artist, known for her collaboration with New York artist Martinka Wawrzyniak and creative team Bombas and Par, among others. And I've recently known that Dawn have written a book for kids. Dawn, just a couple of greeting words to our audience.
Sure. Hello. It's nice to see you all. I'm happy to be here today. I feel very blessed to speak with Avery Gilbert. I've read so much of your research, so it's nice to speak with you today, and I'm happy to see all of you as well. We're logging in from New York, where the weather is pretty overcast, but we're getting into the fall season, which smells wonderful. So.
And I need to explain here something. This video that we're going to show now comes from excerpts of our interview that we did 2 years ago during the COVID year. And it's going to be like a technical interview. It wasn't supposed to be shown publicly. So you need to excuse some noises or mobile rings. And we've agreed for everybody's convenience here that we're going to screen the question and answer now, and you will get a link in the chat box. So if something is wrong, you can just follow the link and watch the interview. So the interview now.
It really wasn't until I went to perfumery school and my mentor was a synesthete, and I looked at these paintings he had done for brands like Estee Lauder, and I said, I can smell that painting. And he said, oh, you have synesthesia. And what I realized is from day one of learning, because at the beginning of perfumery school where I was training, you have to memorize thousands of ingredients. Mm-hmm. And from day one, when I would smell an ingredient, I automatically saw it. I didn't smell it right away, I could see it. I saw the color, I saw the shape, I saw the texture. And this is how I memorized all of the ingredients. And it was the same way that I had memorized for my chemistry exams, the same way I had learned my calculus and all of these studies that I had done pre starting to train at this perfumery school. And at that time, the only two forms of synesthesia that I realized I had was the color graphem synesthesia. So I, saw colors and numbers and letters, as you're familiar with, and odor or smell synesthesia. So I saw colors and shapes and textures when I would smell, automatically and intuitively. But then over time, because I was exercising it so much, just by making very traditional perfumes, because I was working at Coty, first Avon and then at Coty. And so I would exercise it in perfumes, and the marketing team would come to me and the advertising team would come to me and say, these are the colors we're thinking of using for the juice, or this is the color we're going to use for the bottle or the advertisement. And I would say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't match. And they would say, well, what do you mean? I said, well, the perfume that we've created doesn't smell like that color, or doesn't smell like that texture, it doesn't smell like that emotion. And then the emotional piece started coming into it. I said, it doesn't smell like that emotion. And at first they didn't really know what I was talking about. And I didn't know how I knew that. I just automatically knew that it wasn't going to be successful on shelf because it wasn't cohesive. I went back to NYU to graduate school again. And I started researching a little bit of neuroscience, a little bit of sociology, a little bit of consumer behavior, to realize how we can really understand this part of the brain that functions with olfaction and emotion. Also researching synesthesia. So how could synesthesia play a role? And is synesthesia the perception, is it subjective or is it objective? And tell me your research and your findings here. But in my findings, all of the types of synesthesia that I hit on, it was all subjective, except for olfaction. And so I started doing these global tests in many cities and countries all around the world, because what I found is that most people are not synesthetes, obviously, but everyone can smell color, and they can smell the same colors. And even more, you would think that, okay, so everyone smells color, everyone smells the same color. Really, there's so many cultural differences, generational differences, environmental differences. It doesn't matter. For preferences, odor preferences, it matters where you grow up, the generation you grew up in and your living environment. But for understanding odor through color, it's all the same. And as I was doing all of this studying and getting deeper and deeper into it and starting to work more and more with brands, the other types of synesthesia started to just develop. And what I realized is very quickly, I can taste through color too, which, odor and taste are so intricately linked, they live together anyway. When we put something in our mouth, 85% of it, we're actually smelling, through our saliva and through our olfactive receptors. Only 15% we actually taste. But when I was putting something in my mouth, I could see it. And then I started having it with music. So I could hear something and I could hear music and I could see it. I could see the patterns. I could see, at first it was just two-dimensional patterns and some color. Now I can see it more in a three-dimensional way with color and texture. And this was interesting because at the time I had already created the olfactive identity for Valentino, but he was Pier Paolo, the creative director, was working on a new project, and he just sent me the music. And through the music, I created the perfume. And then I started touching surfaces, like different fabrics, different textiles. And again, I could see everything. And then about 2 years ago, and this is blowing my mind and I haven't looked into it because it's not always comfortable. Now I can feel music in my skin. So when I listen to music, I can feel it on my skin. And I can do the same thing when I look at something. I can feel it in my skin. Well, I think they start off really subtle. They start off really small, just like little moments, and then they just grow. So now I would say they're still not as intense as my olfactive. That's still the biggest one. When I smell something, I see an entire world. that one's probably the most intense. It's even more intense than the one I saw in childhood with the letters and the numbers. And it's probably because I use it the most. I imagine they kind of work in my individual experience like muscles. You know, the more you kind of see it and interact with it, the more that it kind of dominates. But they all build in intensity slowly as they come about. When we're menstruating, our olfactive ability, it's like our emotional state, it's a little bit all over the place. And so during those times, my ability in synesthesia was just helped me win, because I could just focus on the color because it's so consistent, and figure out what the ingredients were. And he understood that because he could tell all of us when we were, you know, menstruating or ovulating, which seems like a very intimate detail of our lives, and it was, but it's just part of the world that we live in the perfumery space. So, you know, I would say to him, okay, you know, I'm having a difficult day, but okay, I smell pink. He's like, okay, go with that. And so with Lady Gaga, we went in as Cody, because she's a very big celebrity and was at the time as well. We went in with the traditional marketing view of here's, you know, 5 or 7 marketing concepts, and here are some perfumes that go along with them. And she wasn't satisfied. And so she was there, and Nick Knight was there, who's quite a famous photographer and filmographer at this point, and Nicola Formichetti, who was her stylist, who's also a very famous fashion designer now, and someone that she called her ears, you know, and eventually she called me her nose. And so she wasn't happy with what was presented. And I said, okay, I said, Gaga, what color is your music? Tell me what your music looks like. What color is it? What shape is it? How does it move? How does it feel? And so she started explaining to me the shape of her music and how she composes music and what that means. And then in color and dimension. And so we had this entire conversation about that. And then I said, okay, I have it. And I left and I created 2 new perfumes. And I went to see her a month later with the 2 new ones, and she couldn't decide which one she wanted more. And eventually the one that was launched is because it slightly did better on the global test that we did before we launched it, but she couldn't decide which one was more her. And so the process ended up only being on the shape and texture and dimensionality, and literally how she sees her music and then how it makes her feel. I think for my work, it's the opposite. It's a gift. It's an absolute gift. I can do things so much quicker, so much more efficiently, because I have a vision for everything right away. For life, it's terribly disruptive. I'm always seeing things, so it can be hard to focus and hard to even for me, it's hard to make decisions on what I like versus I don't like, because I can see dimension within everything. So I don't have absolute loves of things or hatred of things. My world is not black and white. My world is so many colors. And so it's hard to communicate with people sometimes. It's hard to make choices. It's hard to relax. I have a very hard time just relaxing, because there's so much going on all the time, whether my eyes are closed or open. So yeah, in work, it's a complete blessing. And in life, it's a challenge. Every person that I've met that has synesthesia, and I don't know if this is the case for you, is an artist. And not just an artist on the side or a creative on the side. It's what they do. It's their primary voice, and their primary production, if you would say, in this life. And I think we all do it for the same reasons. You know, the people that produce art and the people that have synesthesia, I think there's a level of art form. Like, I work with a lot of perfumers that are brilliant perfumers, but they don't have synesthesia, and you can smell the difference in their work. You know, and then you look at different fine art, I'm a big fan of Kandinsky. I didn't understand until I understood he was a synesthete, because I could feel his work. I could live in his work. It's interesting. It's almost like with the synesthesia, you go into another level, and it's like you can get a little bit closer to finding that antidote, a little bit closer, but maybe that's just the ego talking, and it's untrue. I don't know. I don't know. When I started the formula, we started it with the smell of dirt, with the smell of a leather shoe, with the smell of sweat, with the smell of grass. And so the first piece of the scent smells like a soccer cleat in dirt. And then we started thinking about a basketball and how a basketball bounces, because now you have the running from the soccer cleat, but then you have like a basketball bouncing. And so what is the smell there? And the most important smell there is the smell of your hands, actually. And so we recreated the smell of when your hands touch a basketball, your sweat mixed with the rubber from the basketball. And then we wanted to get the stop-start motion, because it's not a continual loop. So what makes you stop? Well, the most dynamic sound for stopping is on a basketball court with the sneaker, that screech that happens. Well, what does that smell like? It's a very specific smell when a sneaker screeches on a basketball court. So we took that smell, which has a very particular color too, and we recreated that smell and put that in there. And the last thing we did, which was more functional, is, they wanted the smell of Air Force One. So what does Air Force One smell like when you open the box, when they're brand new? And that smell is interesting because it gives you, like, for people that love sneakers, it gives you a little jolt, that, brand new sneakers, and especially for kids. And so from there, we got the colors, we got the textures, but mostly the movement, which is very tied into the emotion. And to get it to lift even more, I used an ingredient that I don't talk about, but an ingredient that allows a fragrance from the bottom to the top to kind of, move up.
Yes.
When I think about my color smell synesthesia, there's already a system in place because everyone smells the same colors. I just, through my synesthesia, I do it automatically and intuitively. So there is a system already in place, so I don't have to search for it. I try to go into deeper depths than potentially I was before, and my mind does that with adding texture and shape and whatnot. I have synesthetic experience throughout my meditations, and I meditate every day, at minimum for 45 minutes in the morning, and there's no logical or rational, or I can't translate what I see into an explanation or into an understanding, or it exists solely on its own without me. It's almost like it is like I'm diving into my unconscious or my subconscious. I don't even know, but I'm diving into another part of myself that in some way has no relationship to the part of myself that's with you right now. And it doesn't feel like the search is futile, though. I don't want to give up. And in fact, I just want to go deeper and deeper and deeper and see if it reveals itself at some moment.
I do. So I have the smell synesthesia, just like her. I also see colors when I hear sounds, any sort of sound. So like that sound, or listening to music, or even when I meditate and it's quiet, whatever sounds come in, I can hear. And then also, like her, when I see letters and numbers, they have certain colors associated with them. We first learned that we had synesthesia when John was in perfumery school, when we were probably 23, 24. And so I still didn't really understand what it was. She would come home from perfumery school, stick a blotter under my nose, which I don't know if I have any blotters with me, but basically she would come home with a fragrance make me smell it and say, what color is this? And I would tell her, and she like, that's amazing. And she did that multiple times. And she said, we have synesthesia. I said, well, what is that? And so I learned more and more about it as I realized what it was and the different ways that it came into my life. Yeah, they're basically the same colors. Our letters and our numbers, probably up to a certain point. We've never really gone above 100. And depending on the day, they might be shades of difference. You know, I might think something is more of like a grassy green one day. She might think it's more of like a hunter green. So the shading might vary on some days, but generally we have the same colors and numbers and letters. The fact that Dawn, first and foremost, can create using her mind, you know, using the colors in her mind, using the textures in her mind, the emotions, all of the shapes, all of the ways she uses synesthesia to put something in a bottle just with her mind. I think the end result is really how it all plays out, how we're successful. So when she takes a brand through our creative process, and a lot of it is synesthesia, and then she shows them their fragrance or their scent, and they smell it and say, that is us. They want it to be such a huge event. They want it to be so, and everyone's in the room and everyone's excited, and they smell it and they say, well, yeah, that's us. And she says, I know that's you. And so that is it right there. And it's hard to put that into, you know, if you're thinking about marketing in terms of the front piece of marketing where you're talking to people and trying to get them to that meeting. It is a challenge there because all of our competitors, they're trying to say the same thing. But at the end of the day, when you talk to one of our clients and they say, yes, I mean, she put us into this formula and, you know, this will forever be what we smell like. This is who we are.
That was it. Thank you very much for such a rich and interesting interview. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions or comments. Everyone will have a chance to ask during the Q&A session. And just now, it's time for me to present our second speaker. Today, it is Professor Anina Rich, a professor at the School of Psychological Sciences at Macquarie University, where Professor Rich also serves as the director of the Perception in Action Research Center. Professor Rich's research interests involve cognitive processes that underpin visual search, sustained attention, and the neural underpinnings of attention. And her second major area of interest involves multisensory integration, which underlies perception, and that includes research on synesthesia. In her research, Professor Rich uses various methods, including psychophysics and neuroimaging. Her research has gained remarkable insights into the rare condition of synesthesia. Professor Rich, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We are very happy to host you today, and please feel free to share your screen whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Can I just check that you can see my screen?
Yes.
Great. First of all, that was so interesting. I've got 100 questions. Mine will be a bit different. I don't have synesthesia. I feel like I'm massively missing out in terms of what I might be capable of. But yeah, really interesting. I have lots of questions. Some of our things overlap, which I think is really great because converging diverse perspectives, I think, brings such richness to what we can do in science and hopefully what we can do in art and other areas as well. So thank you so much. And thank you also, Anton and Marina, for inviting me to be part of this very interesting series. I would like to start by acknowledging that I am on Aboriginal land and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Gadigal Nation. The land was never ceded and it will always be Aboriginal land. So I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging here in Australia. I'm coming to you from Sydney. We're at 7:30 a.m. And I thought I would start by just giving a bit of a big picture. Really, I've got, like, as I said, 100 questions about the perfumery and that sort of thing, but I'll try and concentrate on my stuff for a little bit. in a sense, essentially, when I think of what do I mean by the big picture, what I really look at is, or I'm interested in, is the complexities of our perception. So how is it that all of that sensory input that's coming into your brain at any point is selected and constructed and interpreted to give us this complex movie, if you like, of the world, a multi-sensory movie? How do we do that? How do we see and hear and taste and smell? So we can easily process really complex, even just visual scenes. Like if you look at this wonderful picture by Alice Grover, it seems effortless to extract the meaning from that. And yet there's more information in that one image than you can possibly be aware of at any one time. And if you add that to all the other sensory information your brain is receiving, so other visual information from your peripheral vision and sound and smell and touch, and then you start to see what a challenge this actually is. So our brains combine all of this information, most of the time pretty accurately, to give you that conscious experience of the world. And right now, even though we're video teleconferencing, you're integrating the sound of my voice with my lips moving. And of course, that's why if you've got a delay between the video and the audio, it makes it much harder to understand people. Hopefully, it's all integrated and it's working well. If the timing is good, it allows you to integrate that information and extract meaning much easier than if you either had only visual or only auditory information. So in my lab, as Marina kindly said in the intro, I do study attention, but the other major research stream are different types of synesthesia. And so in my lab, we've been studying a number of different types. The four main ones we study are grapheme color synesthesia, which has been nicely introduced already. And so people with grapheme color synesthesia report these highly consistent, usually, experiences of colour when they see letters and numbers. And so a grapheme colour synesthete might say something like, as a child, I can remember puzzling over why not everyone knew that 4 was red. So that's a quote from one of my synesthetes. It really highlights the fact that for most people, synesthesia has occurred for as long as they can remember. I think there's some really interesting things to unpack with Dylan's recent synesthesias. Another might said, Tuesday's yellow. I don't see it anywhere in particular. Rather, I have a general awareness of yellowness in relation to the word. This really illustrates some of the differences between people in how they describe it, because language is actually a really difficult medium to try and communicate something to those of us who've never experienced synesthesia. We also work on auditory visual synesthesia. And so when we get people in the lab and we play them different tones, they can illustrate their synesthesia. And then we can use both the grapheme colour synesthesia and the auditory visual synesthesia experiences to construct objective measures. So for example, here's the experience for one of my synesthetes in response to these different tones. Hopefully this still works. And what you can see with this is that although the individual experience of a big blue ball and a small white dot might be different for you if you've got synesthesia, or different to what you think might match specifically, actually in general, if we ask people who are non-synesthetes, we get these really systematic patterns. So if I gave you those two objects and I said, which of these tones does it go with? Overwhelmingly, people will put the low tone with the dark, large object and the high tone with the small, bright object. And this has sort of led to, among lots of other data, a feeling that synesthesia really seems to build on mechanisms we all share. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. I've also worked on olfactory synesthesia, although it is much rarer than the two forms I've mentioned so far. And there's various possibilities for why that might be. But what I've noticed is that olfactory synesthetes tend to also have other forms of synesthesia, and Dawn mentioned this earlier. So I almost think of it like there's a hierarchy of complexity, and maybe it builds on the complexity of those senses, because in many ways, certainly from the perspective of trying to study it scientifically, olfaction is really challenging. You know, it's a chemical sense, it's slow, it adapts, it evokes different things in different ways. Whereas, you know, if I get you to match the color for a letter, it's like usually 1 or 2 colors, I can get a pretty good match, and then I can manipulate things. Much harder in the realm of olfaction. So the synesthesia that is evoked by smells also correspondingly seems to be more complex. So this is an example of one of my synesthetes experiences. And then more recently, we've also been working on mirror touch synesthesia, where seeing someone being touched evokes an experience of touch. Can I just check you're still there? Yes, good. So I'm not going to go into a lot of the sort of methodology today because we've got a short period of time, but I just wanted to touch on this challenge of how can we measure synesthesia? And it really is actually way beyond synesthesia. How do we measure perception? What we experience is inherently subjective. So at any point I can talk to you and we can maybe discuss what the color of this pen is, for example, and we might agree using language that to me it's purple, and I might call it something different, but we can never know that what we're actually seeing is the same. So when we talk about how to measure synesthesia, you've actually got the same challenge when you want to measure anything to do with people's internal experiences. But we can sort of go with that direct, the direct measures where we're asking people about their experiences, and that's really useful. It gives us really rich insights into what the experience might be like. Some challenges. So it's really difficult to describe synesthesia as it is for perception in general. And so what I've tended to do is to use these direct reports to kind of get a characterization of the phenomenon, and then use that to give you clues for further testing where we use indirect measures. And so by indirect or objective measures, it's essentially looking at the effect synesthesia has on something else. And so that can be another task, or it could be, in our work, we've also done neuroimaging, for example, where we're looking at what's happening in the brain of people when they're experiencing synesthesia and asking them to do another task. So you're not asking people to actively do their synesthesia, you're looking at the effect it has on something else. Okay, so now let's have a quick look at what we've found out about olfactory synesthesia. And this was a study that actually came to fruition through serendipity, as many research projects do. Alex Russell, who's shown here, was a PhD student at the time at University of Sydney, and he was studying wine appreciation and wine tasting, and he had people coming into the lab and smelling wines and tasting wines, and then he wanted them to describe their experiences. And I'd given a talk the week before about synesthesia, not about olfactory synesthesia. And so when one of his participants said, oh, well, this one sort of evokes kind of guitar, and it's sort of the higher pitched, like when it's twanging, it gave really descriptive auditory experiences in response to smelling these wines. So he, the coincidence was that he just found out about synesthesia. And so together with Richard Stevenson, who is an expert in olfaction and gustation, we decided to try and find out what we could about olfactory synesthesia. So we recruited 6 synesthetes who, many of whom actually, as I said, had already come to our attention through their other synesthesias, who said, oh yes, I have visual experiences for smell. So it turns out that the having sound from smell is even rarer, but we were able to get people who have essentially report odors when they smell different odors, they reported different visual images. And we recruited them into the lab, and we got them to do 2 to 3 testing sessions where we presented them with 20 distinct odors. Now, we did it orthonasally. The results I'm going to show you today are from the sniffing, so the orthonasal. But as Dawn said, a lot of flavour is actually retronasal olfaction. And so we do actually have some results from that as well. But today, for time, I'm just going to show you the main findings. So obviously you can't see necessarily all of those smells, but it gives you a sense of the type of stimuli. And essentially what we did was we selected stimuli that would be distinguishable and varied in terms of hedonics, so how pleasant they were, how much people might like them, irritancy, intensity, familiarity, and nameability. So what we asked people to do was, first of all, take a good sniff. These are all in, the same coloured bottles, and you sort of squeeze them as you sniff, and try to name it. After that, they were asked to reproduce their synesthetic experiences if they could. So if it elicited a visual image, can you try and draw what it is, either on the computers? One participant preferred to use pencils, just to try and get a sense of what the experience was. We then asked them to use some category scales. So we wanted them to rate the odour on irritancy. Was it very irritable? Did it irritate your nose? How strong it was? Was it familiar? So was it, I've definitely smelled it before, or I've never smelled this before, and how much they liked it. Here's an example from our synesthetes for smelling a caramel-like odour. So if I give this to non-synesthetes, typically people will say things like, I don't know, it's caramel, if they identify it, caramel, so it's kind of brown. And what you can see is that the synesthetic experiences are more complex than that. And the first thing to note is that in contrast to, say, perhaps grapheme colour synesthesia, where typically a single colour is reported, it might be in the shape of a letter or a sense. In olfactory synesthesia, the images are much more complex. So here's the caramel, here's from like a burnt type of odour from our 6 synesthetes. Okay. And at this point, even simple things like, how do we measure how consistent these images over time are, become more complex. So we had 2 different sessions, and in each session they were given the same smells but in a randomised order and asked to just illustrate their experiences in both sessions independently. Okay. So in other forms of synesthesia, it's been relatively easy to check how consistent images are. Turns out for olfaction, it's a little bit more complex, but these images do appear to be quite consistent over time. So if we have a look at one synesthete's response for smelling a sort of plastic smell, you can see that you would clearly say that there are some similarities between these images, especially if you compare it to, say, different odours, so the scent of strawberry versus the scent of mushrooms. But I don't want to just look at it and say, I think this is more consistent than this one. I want to have some data to be able to sort of see whether or not that's the case. And so for this study, we recruited 20 naive non-synesthete raters to decide how consistent those images were. So they basically were just shown the images. They were shown 2 images at a time that could either come from the same smell or from different smells. And they were asked to do a series of ratings on how similar those images were. And so if we have a look at the data from those 20 participants, so here what I've got is, sorry, I have to look over here to see what you're seeing and use my pointer. Can you see my mouse? Yeah, great. So what we have over here is their mean similarity ratings, with the maximum being 7 and the minimum being 1. And this is for images that came from synesthetes smelling the same odour, and they were naming it consistently. So on time 1, they said, oh yeah, that's lemon. Here's my experience for that. And on time 2, they said, oh, that's lemon, and drew their experience. And you can see that when the same odour is named consistently, you get the highest similarity ratings of those images by non-synesthetes. When you have the same odour, so it was strawberry on both sides, but it wasn't identified consistently. Once they said strawberry, the other time maybe they said raspberry or something different, you get a drop in the similarity, but it's still greater than when they were different. They were images generated by different odours. Okay, so what that tells us is that naming has a lot to do with it. So if you're able to identify that smell, you have a much more consistent representation, including in the synesthesia. So some of the similarity seems driven by the consistency of naming the odour, but there's something else going on as well. There's some residual similarity when it's not the case that the odour has been identified. And so we then moved on to ask, what drives that? And it turns out that the only factor that differentiates between whether or not sorry, back up a bit. What we did then was we had to identify the odours that synesthetes didn't name consistently. And then within those, we chose odours that differed the most and the least, so the absolute difference, for the other ratings we've got of irritancy, strength, familiarity, hedonics, and so on. And so what we could do is we could say, okay, well, this odour was really reliable in intensity. This odour was really unreliable in the rating of intensity. What happened to their similarity of their images? Okay, and what you can see is that actually reliable or unreliable ratings on these doesn't really make a difference in terms of the similarity of the images in those ratings. except for hedonics. So it seems that what is driving the similarity in the synesthetic experience when naming is unreliable is whether or not it's a reliable rating of whether or not the person liked the smell. So that hedonic or emotional component seems to be driving the similarity in the synesthesia. So Dawn referred to this before in the sense that I think the phrase was across people we all smell colour, which I thought was great because that's a very synesthetic phrase. And I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you mean is that people will tend to give the same colour for the same smells. Different people will give the same colour for the same smells. Yeah, great. And so that's the type of finding where it raises questions about maybe synesthetes are like an extreme, but on a continuum of experience. And so our research and that of other labs has really come down on the side of synesthesia building on mechanisms that we all share. And in particular, it seems clear that synesthetes aren't, well, I would argue that synesthetes' brains aren't fundamentally different in structure in a major way, but maybe they use it a bit differently. And so what we also had, actually this study was done before the synesthesia one, but makes more sense to present afterwards. It was to actually look in non-synesthetes for this sort of consistency. Do we all have subtle associations with odours, much like we do for the other senses? So across senses, if I ask you to, like we said with the sound and colour and object, if I ask you to choose a colour to go with a sound, non-synesthetes are also very consistent in choosing dark colours for low pitches and light colours for high pitches. Is it the case that we also have that with odours? So we got 18 non-synesthetes and those same 20 odours. So as I said, this was done before the synesthesia ones, because when you've got special participants, you want to make sure everything's working perfectly before you test them. And we asked our participants to name the odour, select a colour that matched best, rate those same factors, and also just about, does this have a texture or a shape or a sound or a taste? What does it bring to mind? For non-synesthetes, we have to be a little bit more specific about what we're asking, because if you just say, what does this experience give you? They're like, it's a smell. Doesn't really give you very much. So we do see with this study, though, that participants can, sorry, I've jumped ahead there. Participants can generate experiences, even if they're not actually, they're saying, oh, it goes together. They're not experiencing it. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I explained that very well, but essentially we're asking non-synesthetes to just make up stuff, and then we're looking to see whether or not that report is consistent across people. The first thing to note is that we're really bad at identifying odours, and this is consistent with what we've seen in the literature. The best was lemon, which is a very distinctive smell, and only 50% got that. But we did find, despite this, that there were consistent reports across time, so multiple instances of the same smell, where people were giving essentially similar colour or sound or shape or texture or taste. And all but the odour to sounds mapping showed higher agreement across people than we'd expect by chance. So it does suggest that even in those of us who can't smell a perfume and do amazing things with it, we do have these subtle cross-modal mappings. Now, odour sounds wasn't consistent in our data, but there's an artist, a multisensory artist called Joe Basinska, who had also looked across non-synesthetes and found some matching agreement across people, such as lemon or birds, lemon and bird song. So I came across, Joe contacted me when she had a Culture at Work art science residency in Sydney, because she needed a scientific partner. And what she was working on, she does a lot of work with multisensory stimuli and constructing arts installations. And I've got her website here, and I encourage you all to go and have a look. It's some really interesting work. But the centrepiece of her Culture at Work art science residency was an auditory olfactory experiment in which we were trying to identify the correspondences between certain sounds and certain odours, and look at how they might be influencing each other. And so together we also with Mem Mahamat, one of my colleagues at Macquarie, we helped Joe design an experiment to measure these correspondences. And you can see here participants in the first stage of the study, where they progressed around 10 smelling stations, and they were asked to rate an unidentified aroma for a number of different characteristics. And that included, you know, personal preference and perceptual characteristics like harshness and softness and so on. And they were also asked if they could name it and whether or not it evoked any personal associations or memories for them, because of course olfaction does that a lot. And then they were asked similar questions for a series of sounds and music samples that were played through the experiment. So they then went through and gave information about how they felt those things matched. So what was the frequency of the sound that they felt best matched each aroma. And then Joe created a residency exhibition called Osmic Resonance, where she set up little vials of scent and headphones that then played soundscapes. And then the attendees were also able to rate like how much they thought these things corresponded. So it was a really interesting experience, very, very different for me, but also nice to be able to kind of give some experimental design and learn about how that can then be used in art. So from this overall, I've tried to keep it quite brief, but across different types of synesthesia, it seems that it builds on mechanisms that we all share. We all seem to have these implicit mappings between our senses. They may be more subtle for olfaction, but there certainly is evidence that each of us might have this deep down. Not that we would have synesthesia deep down, but that the mechanisms that underpin it might be there. And this is even though acknowledging that there are, of course, individual differences. So at an individual level, when you just meet one synesthete, it seems to be completely idiosyncratic. But what we've seen across all of the forms of synesthesia that we've studied is that when you look across a group, you can start to see systematic patterns. So, you know, for example, if we look across a group of synesthetes, with auditory visual synesthesia, we can see some underlying patterns. They also happen when we ask non-synesthetes to just make up associations. So it makes sense that even if you have a genetic predisposition to develop synesthesia, the actual experiences and pairs that you have must be due to some sort of learning experience somewhere, right? Particularly for things like grapheme color synesthesia, we don't have a genetic blueprint for which language we're going to learn, let alone what color might go with it, right? I mean, this is an experiential aspect to it. So I think there's some really interesting questions there about how olfaction plays in there. But in general, I think of synesthesia, you know, it's a way of showing how our multisensory experience of the world kind of is often underestimated in a way. And synesthesia is an opportunity to get a unique insight into the way we bind together all of that sensory information into a concept of an object that we can then experience and use in the world. So for example, you know, it may be that synesthesia, as we've heard, can influence how you appreciate a perfume, how you construct a perfume, how you appreciate and experience a glass of wine, perhaps even with, you know, some people have said that it can increase our understanding of things like empathy. And my student Sophie, who's looking at neurotouch synesthesia, is trying to understand some of the links there. I think, you know, as I said, our multi-sensory experience of the world is often underestimated. We study like little bits in isolation because that's manageable. And I think, you know, work like that of Joe and finding out about how Dawn does her amazing work really emphasizes the way that the richness of our experience in each modality is influenced by our other senses. They're really not separate. So obviously studying objective measures of olfactory synesthesia has significant challenges. You can't get thousands of trials, for example, but there's really great opportunities with that phenomenon to see how it links with the experience in all of us. So I will finish. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this. And I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators on the work that I presented today and my current synesthesia team, and of course the synesthetic and non-synesthetic participants, without whom there isn't any research. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anina, for such an interesting, incredible presentation. So I'm going to present our third speaker today. It's Dr. Avery Gilbert, a smell scientist and author. Dr. Gilbert has conducted research on human odor perception, both in academia and multinational perfume companies. His consulting firm helps companies design scented consumer products, and he's also the founder of Headspace Sensory LLC, a startup company that is quantifying the aroma profiles of cannabis. Dr. Gilbert published a book on the latest discoveries and the long-held beliefs about the sense of smell, titled What the Nose Knows, The Science of Scent in Everyday Life. Dr. Gilbert, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I'm very happy to host you, so please begin whenever you're ready.
All right, well, first off, I'd like to thank both the organizers, Anton and Marina, for inviting me to take part in the symposium. I initially resisted their invitation on the grounds that I'm not an expert on synesthesia. Rather, as you will learn, my interest in the topic centers on its phenomenology, its natural history, and practical applications. And while I'm not a cognitive theorist, I do have some ideas about cross-sensory correlations and where they fit into our wider mental experience, and I will come to that toward the end. When it comes to synesthesia and the art of perfumery, I see two distinct topics. One concerns creation, and the other is about experience. The creative side is where fragrance is brought into the world by perfumers, fragrance evaluators, brand marketers, bottle designers, package designers, the whole crew. The experiential side is about fragrance as a physical presence, how people perceive not only the scent, but the bottle, the juice, the packaging, and all the imagery and commentary that goes with it. My personal introduction to perfumery took place at Givaudan, a multinational fragrance house. I was hired to build and run a sensory psychology department. The formal goal was to understand consumer perception of scent at the level of basic science, but really the important thing was to put that knowledge to use for the company's commercial benefit. Thus, my responsibilities were both on the creative side and the experiential side. So, for example, I would meet with perfumers and evaluators as they discussed and modified their initial creations. My consumer research group would measure how well trial fragrances were tracking the creative brief. And I would report the results to clients who are often eager for such data, and also to our perfumers who, as you can imagine, were initially defensive about this rude intrusion into their professional domain. But by describing the results in terms of sensory metaphors, I could connect with perfumers in a non-threatening and collaborative way. So, for example, I might say, listen, Francois, Mod 17 gives people a strong reddish purple interpretation and impression, but Mods 11 and 12 are only slightly pinkish. So whatever you're doing in Mod 17, keep doing more of it. And I don't get involved with raw materials and concentrations and stuff. That's too intrusive, but they could happily take those kind of, that sort of feedback and run with it in their further creation. Since very early on at Givaudan, I was struck by how often perfumers use multisensory metaphors. A scent can be light or heavy, sweet, sharp, rounded, warm, simple, complex, and so on. And I have no doubt that most perfumers are personally aware of multisensory correlations. I mean, clearly we heard very in robust detail from Dawn on that. Some perfumers, such as Ron Winograd, may experience even strong involuntary synesthesia, the formal type synesthesia. Many also receive their fragrance training with the Jean Carl method, which originated at Royer Bertrand DuPont and is still widely used in the industry. This method encourages a trainee to memorize each raw material by, among other things, creating a personalized memory link. So an example might be, it smells like my dog's scooter after he swims in the lake. It can be as kooky as you want. It just needs to be very specific and create a hook in memory for you when you re-encounter that scent. So synesthetic impressions are excellent memory links when learning raw materials, and they can also help when designing a complex finished fragrance. Now, most perfumers need a mental target when they formulate, and this is usually begins with the client's creative brief. And as they translate it into olfactory terms, their personal multisensory perceptions can help them formulate to the desired impression. Clearly, a perfumer's synesthetic impressions are personal. And at the same time, a fragrance must speak to the public at large. But people differ in their color associations, as we've heard from Professor Rich, but in their auditory associations and so forth. So here we have this paradox. How can a perfumer's private experience become the basis for a public fragrance that appeals to 1 million people, each with their own personal impression of it? And that's not the only factor. When people use scented products, they develop expectations about what a fragrance ought to smell like, even before sampling it. And these expectations are implicit, and consumers often can't articulate them. You try to describe it for me, and they go mute. They can't get very far. So, for example, a cologne that you want to market, say, is evocative of the scent of cool water, could in principle smell of a salty seacoast, a foaming river rapids, or a mossy mountain spring. Those are all possibilities, but history matters. And so the unspoken expectation among consumers, in this case, is that the cologne should smell something like Davidoff's Cool Water. So you've got a cultural history, a collective cultural and history operating as well. So olfactory synesthesia is relatively common among perfumers, and it's useful to their work, but specific cross-sensory links might not generalize to the broader public. Well, does that mean we're flying blind when we're launching a new scent and trying to figure out how to package it and present it? Not at all. We can ask consumers about their multisensory impressions of it, not only about the scent itself, but the color of the juice, the shape of the bottle, the decorations on the packaging, and so forth. In fact, I've developed an array of methods to gather such data. These methods grew out of research I conducted at Givaudan, namely a series of consumer studies inspired by the sensory metaphors I heard in offices and conference rooms around the world. We found that raw materials, that is, individual essential oils and fragrance chemicals, arrange themselves in an orderly fashion along the auditory dimension of pitch. This is work that came out in 96, 97. In other words, stronger dry down notes are matched to lower pitch, while delicate evanescent top notes are matched literally to higher pitch tones. We also discovered that raw materials have distinct color impressions, and that increasing the concentration and odor intensity of a given material leads to a color match with a darker version of the same hue. So it might still be purple, but it's got more black in it. It's a darker purple. Conversely, a less intense scent produces a pastel version of its color match. So despite this person-to-person variation, we see reliable tendencies about which colors go with which odors. Listening to Dawn, I was reminded of something. I didn't publish it. It wasn't a formal scientific project, but a client was Riviera Concepts up in Canada, in Ontario, and they had a collection of designer fragrances. It was Alfred Sung, Bob Mackie, Jacqueline Smith, and they were trying to promote the entire collection and yet differentiate them in a way so that they could offer specific ones to an individual woman who was thinking of purchasing a new scent. And so we used a consumer research house, and we had people match each of the scents to a texture, an actual fabric texture like corduroy versus silk, match it to the feel of a shape that they weren't looking at. They were blindfolded, so it was either like a little plastic star or a round wooden ball and so forth, or a color. We gave them color samples. And so from those data, I established a set of multimodal correlates. So we went to the Hudson Bay store, and we set up a large steamer trunk with little drawers. And the lady would come up, she'd put her hand in, feel the objects, and say, "Oh, I like the pointy one." And then she'd put her hand in another drawer and feel the different fabrics and say, "Well, I like the silky one." And then looking at color swatches, she said, "Well, I like that bright orange." And that combination would lead to a recommendation of 1 or 2 perfumes out of the entire collection. So it had all the romance of a fortune-telling session, and yet it was based on the scientific correlations across the senses to those specific fragrances, and it was quite a hit. Anyway, back to science. Years later, I did a study with Lori Lucchina and Alan Fridland. We gave people an emotion word like angry or happy, and let them use a digital color wheel to select the match. And the resulting color palettes were distinct for each emotion. And that's an interesting and useful result, but is it really an example of synesthesia? Yeah, strictly speaking, no. But that brings us to a bigger question. What are the mental processes underlying synesthesia and cross-modal correlations in general? I've been reading this fantastic book, relatively new, by Ian McGilchrist. It's called The Matter with Things, Our Brains or Delusions and the Unmaking of the World. So McGilchrist's theme is how the two hemispheres of our brain differ in how they apprehend the world and how they interact with one another to create or experience an understanding of it. I'll just quote here from a Substack I published earlier this year. McGilchrist's basic thesis is that the left hemisphere focuses on manipulating objects in the world. So it works to reduce experience into sharply defined categories and verbal formulations. It is intolerant of ambiguity. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere has a wider focus. It observes patterns and interactions as they emerge, and it is not bothered by ambiguity. The left hemisphere sees only individual parts and pieces. The right sees the whole picture. Sometimes we need the left hemisphere reductionist perspective, and sometimes we need the right's global view of the ongoing gestalt. Now, when it comes to smell, I believe we use the left hemisphere reductionist approach very rarely. We might use it when cooking. For example, do I need to add more garlic to this sauce? Or when we're problem solving, it's like there's some weird, what's that weird smell coming from the engine compartment? You got to get to the bottom of that. Instead, I think most of the time we approach smell holistically in the manner of the right hemisphere. So for example, you might notice a chill in the air, the leaves have changed color, and you smell smoke from nearby chimneys. So you experience that seamlessly as a beautiful autumn day. At least that's the ongoing flow of experience as holistically conveyed by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere, in contrast, would want to identify the exact temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, the specific hue of the leaves, and whether the neighbors are burning oak kindling or Presto logs in their fireplace. Completely different way of apprehending the world. I think synesthesia in general and synesthetic perception of odor in particular follows the right hemisphere mode of experience. Odor-linked colors and sounds are part of the mix, part of the gestalt. We don't rely on them for close analysis and decision making. And I think this ties in with something other people have noted about smells. They can be assigned an unlimited range of emotional value or memory value. And these values can be altered or reprogrammed, if you will, by subsequent experience. So in a way, smells are the ultimate analog for random access memory. This makes them compelling at a personal and experiential level, and yet hard to classify and describe in language. So once again, we have a right hemisphere holistic perception counterbalancing the linear compartmentalized view of the left. A couple of final thoughts. In their work, perfumers use both left and right hemisphere modes of experience. So on the left, they have a keen awareness of individual raw materials and concentrations, not to mention cost per kilo, which is high in the awareness at any given moment. And on the right side, they have a gestalt-like impression of the scent in flux, as it dries down on skin over time and as it diffuses through a room and changes with dilution. So both modes of perception are essential for creative success in perfume. Finally, in the art of perfumery, olfactory synesthesia, I think olfactory synesthesia by itself doesn't get you very far. To get traction, cross-sensory links need to be anchored to a concept or an object in much the same way as perfumers work to a client's creative brief. I think that's their anchor. And I think this is the lesson of Christophe Laudamiel's pioneering scent opera, Green Aria, which I attended years ago in New York at the Guggenheim. And nothing ever like it since, or before or since. But it had lovely music. The scents were beautiful and very distinctive, but they only gestured at unseen characters and toward an unspoken story. There was no libretto, no stage action for them to play off of. It was all left hemisphere parts and pieces, no right hemisphere flow of narrative. And I think synesthetic links can enhance the experience of an operatic performance, but they can't just pull one out of thin air. So that's my take.
Everybody, thank you very much. This is very insightful and, well, so gorgeous to know how this topic of synesthesia and smell is submersed into this discussion about the explicitity and implicity and individual versus common experience. And this is what makes the sense of smell so special in humans, unlike probably this in general life forms, overall life forms. And now this is the stage for question and answers. And at this stage, the priority goes to our speakers. So in the first exchange, you can just ask each other of something that might seem interesting or challenging or discussable or worthy of developing. So Avery and Dawn, just please, if you have questions.
Hi, I have, so I actually trained with Jean Bichard at Givaudan for 2 years. And the first color synesthesia, odor color synesthesia research that I ever read was actually published by Givaudan. So it's fascinating that you worked with them to create their these tools that I have actually used in the past. I work mostly with Firmenich today, but sometimes I still keep in touch with everyone at Giv. Wonderful perfumers. I think I have a question for Anina. So I mentioned that, so I trained at IFF for in perfumery school, and when I was training, as I mentioned on my video, the Von Winograd, who was the leader of the school, would tell us when we were ovulating or menstruating, and it was very clear based on if we could identify the raw materials that we were learning, which were like 4,500 at the time. So I was wondering, I saw that your synesthetic images slightly changed over time. I was wondering, because 5 of them were women, your synesthetes, if you know if they were ovulating or menstruating when they did their different drawings, because it would have changed not necessarily in color, but in detail. Because when you're menstruating, like emotionally, you're all over the place. And when you're ovulating, women, we know this. I know it sounds a little bit strange for men, but we're laser sharp with our language and our emotion, our everything. Our brain just works very quickly and profoundly. When we're menstruating, we're kind of, like, it's just a little bit harder to have that laser vision. And it's the same thing with olfaction. The colors don't change if you're a synesthete, but the way you laser focus in on the details does. So I was wondering if you had that overlay with the images with your female synesthetes, or if you could find out, because that could be super fascinating to complement the research.
Anina, this was question to you, if you can hear us.
I can't hear you. I'm so sorry. Murphy's Law. Daughter walks herself to school every day. Today she fell over and had to come back with blood streaming down her leg. She's completely fine. She's doing first aid. I will drop her to school late. All will be well, but inevitably. So, Dawn, I missed the start of your question, but I think you were asking about our synesthetes in our study. I don't know. I have no idea where they were in the cycle. The thought has never occurred to me to look. And now that I've heard your talk, I will have something to explore, in terms of, I think there is absolutely, this is some of the things where the subjective experience can really guide the science, is I never thought to ask. Next time I will. So I'm sorry I can't answer your question. I do think that there's some other factors that have a big effect on how detailed things are on the second session, and part of it is just how motivated you are, right? So the first time it's novel and you're like trying to illustrate your synesthesia and you probably put a lot of time and effort, and the second time it's like, really? Why do you want me to do it again? You've got my last one. Did you lose it? So yeah, I think there are other factors that also play into it that may or may not be stronger than the menstrual cycle effects, but I will ask.
Oh.
Anyone else of the speakers want to ask each other questions? Or we can go to the audience for questions.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that this was a speaker. I saw the hands up and I was waiting for someone else. I'm very keen to hear the questions that we have, but can I ask one question? when you were talking about your new synesthesias, Dawn, and you said that they're a bit less intense than the ones, I'm interested in, do you still feel that they're involuntary, or is it now that it's more, so we know that attention plays a massive role in whether or not a synesthetic experience is actually evoked. For example, if I present a letter in a way that someone can't attend to it, even if they normally get a colour for that letter, they won't, because they're not attending and identifying the letter. Like, it seems to be that attention to the inducing stimulus. And so when you were describing your new synesthesias, you know, the brain is very adaptable, and I think it makes sense that when you're using it all the time, you're going to be paying a lot more attention to it. Do you feel that they're the same in quality of how involuntary they are, or are there differences?
To be honest, because I have so many at this point, I spend most of my time trying to ignore them, because I get super overwhelmed super quickly, that it's like, it's a brain game. You know, when I started working at Avon, I just started perfumery school at IFF. I remember, and I found out I was a synesthete, and so it was all coming together. And I got into the office one day and I asked the manager, I'm like, how do I turn it off? Like, how do I just turn the whole thing off? Because I live in New York, and I trained at IFF New York, and I got into the subway and I was just like, you know, all I saw was color and shape and texture overlay and everything I smelled. And there was so many intense smells. And she said, you know, it's a brain game. You have to get your brain to shut it off. So over time, as my other synesthetic responses have become really powerful, I've had to kind of, there was one experience I'm having with all my synesthesia, which is, I mean, if anyone's done any psychedelic drugs, it's like being on an LSD trip all the time. And then there's my rational part of my brain that has to kind of, you know, take into account everything I'm experiencing so that I can walk straight and I can, you know, open the door and I can, you know, use my subway card or whatever it is. And so I try to push most of them to the side. Having said that, I was just on a Disney cruise ship for the last 4 days. Disney's one of my clients, surrounded by 4,000 people, and noises and smells and colors. And, you know, it's so intense. You're constantly filled with this multi-sensory input, and having synesthesia, I can tell you yesterday, I was just numb. Because I couldn't get my brain to turn off, you know, like my whole body was vibrating at all times. So I try not to focus on it. If I did focus on all of them all at once, I just wouldn't be able to function like a normal person. I probably wouldn't be able to respond. I have done it, and it's incredibly but I'm also exhausted after, which is strange. Really tired. So yeah, I think that's the only thing I can say at this point. I think it's a gift, but I wouldn't mind if some of them, you know, weren't there. The skin one is particularly weird, that I can feel everything in my skin now. It's a little bit uncomfortable.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a lineup of questions from the audience, if you don't mind. And Mikhail, you are the first to ask.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. Very good event, very nice presentations, very interesting. I have a question mainly for Alina, but it may also apply to the other referees. Alina, at first, I'm very glad to meet you here. And I think we have met first 20 years ago in Hannover in Synaesthesia conference. I found some pictures. If you provide your email address, I can send them over to you. Interestingly, I look quite different on these pictures, but you don't. Okay, my question is, I've read in a textbook that a special feature of the perception of smell is that the neuronal pathway from the sense organs to the limbic system is very short. So that should enable most intense iconic connections. So the associative content of smell is very, very high, as we know. And so maybe someone who smells lemon smell would say, well, that is yellow because lemon is yellow. The question is, are there any indications that this specific short pathway, neural pathway, has an influence on synesthetic effects? Is there any difference? Are there any differences which we can find which may be related to this different pathway. For example, I compare with the auditory pathway, which is quite long, and there are some olives and so some sort of pre-processing areas. And I think this is not the case for the smell. So are there any differences which are interesting for synesthesia?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So absolutely, with olfaction, it's it's really quite a different sense, right? There's the chemical receptors in the nose, and then the olfactory bulb, and then you're really quite directly the connections to the amygdala are there very directly. And you're absolutely right. With the other senses, we get pre-processing in the thalamus, for example, before it even gets to cortex, and it may be that is what builds on that sense that we all have, that smell can evoke memories and emotions so much more directly. In terms of synesthesia, I think it's an interesting question whether or not that should predict that there might be either a different mechanism or perhaps less conceptual mediation for smell. So, for example, with grapheme colour synesthesia, we've proposed that rather than there being some sort of additional unusual hardwired connection between the visual word form area and V4, so for processing letters and then colours. So others have suggested those two areas must be connected in synesthetes in a way that is not the same for the rest of us. Our model is that actually there's a conceptual stage. So identifying letter is key. And so that initial visual word form area processing, probably then that information goes to somewhere like the anterior temporal lobe where we store the concepts of objects and then comes back down to the visual areas. So a more indirect route. Now, how that would work for olfactory synesthesia, I still haven't worked out. Because for olfaction, right, we're very poor at naming smells. And yet they evoke these consistent images, right? So that's why we were kind of looking at like what factors other than naming might drive similarity of images, because we were trying to say, well, what is it that's consistent? And in that case, it seems to be the hedonics, which would fit much more with that sort of direct limbic pathway being something that's key in olfactory synesthesia.
I would knock out a left hemisphere, either with electromagnetic fields or anesthesia, and then take out the verbalized response. I think the verbalized response misleads us a lot when it comes to olfaction, not just in synesthesia, but everybody gets hung up on the naming thing, but that's already a reductive, classificatory, highly focused mode of apprehending that I don't think really applies to smell. But so take the left hemisphere out and then look at the color drawings and matches that you get from people. That would be kind of cool. My 2 cents as a non-brain person.
I would say from our experience, we do, my first research with colors, we gave, large color charts globally to thousands of people at a time and see if they would pick the same colors based on very complex formulas. I mean, we're talking like 150 to over 200 fragrance materials. Now what we do is we do it live. So we do it with like anywhere between 20 to 150 people. And we first give them color squares and they get to choose which colors they would use. We start with raw materials, usually natural ones that they know, like we'll start with mandarin or hexanol, which I know you use, which smells like freshly cut grass. And then we'll get a little bit more complex. We'll give them rose, which has, many more molecules, 300 plus molecules, and we'll give them vetiver, which they don't know, which is important because we want to start giving them ingredients that they don't know to see if they're going to pick the same colors. And then we give them crayons. And we say, okay, can you start drawing these? And they all draw the same pictures. They all draw the same shape. They do a lot of the same texture, and then they do the same shading. And we do this based on simple formulas. So they've never smelled it before, so they have no olfactive memory association. And if they do like it, we see a hedonic skews, and we see them based on generation. And so when we used to do these tests in Germany, we would see that women, and at the time this was 10 plus years ago, women between the age of about 25 and 45 really liked magenta. And so if they liked a perfume, they tend to pick magenta as one of the colors they were smelling. Now what we're seeing when we do it in Gen Z and millennials, if they like something, they'll throw in some blue or some purple for Instagram and Facebook as a hedonic skew. It's fascinating. And so they still pick all the same colors, but if they like it, it skews more towards something. And then of course we have outliers, and the outliers tend to just draw in black and brown for some reason. About 3% of the people that we've tested are outliers, and they just use kind of dark colors because I don't know what's happening in their brain, but I think it goes right to hedonics, and maybe they don't like smell, and they just go right to colors they don't particularly like.
The effect of emojis on the brain.
Thank you.
It's amazing, right?
Okay, thank you very much. Sean, would you ask your questions, please?
So a couple of comments were such. A reply to Dawn's question, or Dawn's comment regarding. Well, I'll just mention that on the synesthesia list, which I've been running for about more than 20 years now, but okay, it's anecdotal, so it's not lab science, but anecdotally, over the past 20 years, there's been many conversations about hormonal influences upon synesthesia. More often women talking about it than men, but the most common type of synesthesia, the most common type of concurrent would be color. So usually they're talking about the colors or such being influenced one way or another. But like I say, this is just anecdotally, but it's fairly solid anecdotal stuff over the 20 years that now the question is, which hormones, what hormones are influencing things? But it seems like we definitely need to investigate hormonal influences upon synesthesia. And once again, I'll add that we need to investigate that regarding men too, because like I say, men don't talk about it much, but it's there. Right, for the men too. I also wanted to just throw in two comments. These are not arguments. These are not arguments or anything like that. They're just sort of like throw them out there for other people to kick around. One is that, right, looking at the data I have, around about 1 out of 17 people who have synesthesia, or in other words, put it this way, about 1 out of 440 people in general has smell to color synesthesia. So that's about what the rate is. It's around about 1 out of every 440 people has it, right? I would say, and then Dawn also mentioned that, if I remember correctly, you mentioned that, almost virtually all the people with smell to color synesthesia that you've interacted with are artists or such.
No, well, I was saying in my experience, most of the people that I've met, maybe it's my community, but a lot of the people that have synesthesia are using in a creative fashion, whether it's through, perfumery or through, aesthetics or whatever it is. I have, and that might just be the people that I meet. Like I haven't met a lot of doctors or lawyers or, that have synesthesia, but maybe that's because the conversation doesn't come up. But most of the people I know that do have synesthesia, they use it creatively in some way.
I just wanted to throw this out again, like not for argument, but for it's a curio. Most of the people who have this type of synesthesia are office clerks. Working in offices, or working at some place like Walmart. It's like stocking shelves. That right? Yeah. Right. And I'm just wondering, if that's the situation, what's their experience like? Because that
interesting.
Yeah. That's all I have. But I wanted wanted to throw those ideas out just like for other people to kick around.
I like it because it's so weird.
Thank you, Sean, for your comments and questions. Before we go to our next person who's going to ask a question, some of us is in a hurry, so if you want to go, if you need to go right now, do please without any worries. Okay, David Levine.
Sorry, before you move on, just because I do have to go, I'm so sorry. I'd love to stay and discuss for longer. I just wanted to say in response to Sean's thing about, like maybe about who might have synesthesia. I do think in our data, we also find that about 24% of our synesthetes are involved in artistic professions, compared to like about 2% of the Australian census data on those occupations. So that was a big survey that we did, a long time ago now, but I expect the pattern hasn't changed. But one of the things that I do think is interesting is that, and important to keep in mind, is that we're always reliant on people self-referring. And so it's quite possible. I remember doing a radio interview at one point where we were talking about this, and I was like, I would love to hear from any tradies who think they have synesthesia, because it's possible that they're just much less likely to contact a research group than someone who uses it in their daily life and is happy to have it. So I do think that we have always, particularly with things like synesthesia, we have to keep in mind how we're hearing from people. It's not a representative sample across occupations. So I have enjoyed this so much. I'm so sorry to miss the rest of the questions. Very happy to receive emails from anyone who had questions specifically for me, and I promise I will reply. Lovely to see you all. My apologies.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you. Okay, last question here is from David Levine. David, you're welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks again for the great presentation. So given that olfaction seems to be a more complex sense, my question is whether a fragrance can authentically recreate potentially a sensation of crossroads between various other senses like touch and sight.
Avery, do you want to go first?
I just have my quick response is that these multisensory links are confirmatory in large part. I don't think people go shopping by, let me try these perfumes to see which one is the most purpley or the most green. But when they smell a product and they look at it, if it's a sharp green smell, it should have an angular bottle and a bright green juice and so on and so forth. So I think you want that kind of multisensory cohesion for a successful presentation of whether it's the product or whether it's an opera or whatever. I don't think again, it comes back to that kind of analytic versus holistic approach. I think when you get the holistic view of it, it kind of all fits together and you're going, yeah, okay. And if it's not hanging together, you get a discordant sense of a not fitting together, which again is a very right hemisphere way to view it. But I don't think it's going to be very specific, as you would hope, or as you're suggesting, if I understand you.
When we develop a scent for a brand, we often deal with large global brands, and so the scent has to be perceived similarly across various groups of people. When I started in the industry at Avon, we would develop fragrances per part of the world. And so the fragrances we developed for India were very different than the fragrances we were developing for China versus Brazil, etc. And when I got to Coty, I remember when I was asked, can you create a global fragrance for Adidas? Is it possible? And at that point, I had done enough research into olfactive preferences, which is a whole different conversation, that I felt confident that I could. I had also looked at the Givaudan retracing color and started putting color charts into our global consumer tests. And so those two aspects together were how we started to create how myself and the perfumers that I was working with at the time started to create global fragrances. Now what I do is more nuanced, whereas we take the color, but we add in the texture, we add in the shape, we add in the weight, we add in the temperature, all things that people can perceive through fragrance, whether they need to be helped to unlock that perception or when they can do it on their own, like a synesthete. And we use that to recreate that experience. And then we back it up through olfactive preferences and target market and emotional, let's say, the emotional reaction that someone could have. So can you exactly recreate the color of something or the experience of something? Not on its own. I think, like Avery was saying, it has to be in combination with something else to anchor it. And in our sense, a lot of the brands we work with just want to scent the air. So they don't get the aesthetic trigger of a bottle or an advertisement, but they do get the aesthetic trigger of the brand environment, which is often showing all the colors of the brand, which has a sound trigger as well, because they've created a signature sound, which has, you know, maybe some taste components if they have food involved, et cetera, et cetera. And they're definitely having an emotional experience. So I think altogether, you can use smell in an aesthetic, synesthetic way or not to translate a brand or translate an idea into a smell. Sure.
Donna, can you talk about your book? Because, well, it was such a surprise when I saw you have a special reading for kids, and the book actually is about smells and color. What is it like? What is it about? What's the idea behind it?
Sure. You know, for most of my career, I stayed away from children because my research shows that, you know, before we're born and then to 10 years old is when we're learning our olfactive preferences. You know, every single memory is compiled with an emotional component and a scent component. And so I didn't really want to play with that in children. You know, there's so many things that they learn throughout those 10 years. And I thought, okay, if they can get through that, and then we can have an impact later. But this opportunity came up with Random House to do a children's book. And I thought, well, most people don't know the connection between color, emotion, and smell in the brain. How can we do that in a fun way? And I had done a paper on autism in children at NYU years before, and I just thought it was fascinating how color can be used to express emotion in terms of art therapy. And so kind of putting all that together with my global color research, we decided, well, actually Random House decided, if I'm honest, when I gave them multiple options, that a rainbow could be very interesting. And so every page of the book is, you know, the color of the rainbow, the emotions that could go along with that, and then of course the vocabulary. So the part of our brain that processes language and speaks is not connected to the part of our brain that smells, as everyone in our industry knows. And so in perfumery school, you learn how to build that bridge. So this little book is to help children start to build that bridge from an early age. The reason this happens is because our sense of smell is fully developed before we're born. So as our other senses are developing and our ability to put language, overlapping them with language happens, our sense of smell is already there. So it's almost like just forgotten. It's also why it's difficult to talk about emotion, although of course we have poetry and we have music and we have so many other things that can help us speak about emotion, and smell is just kind of overlooked unless you're eating something or there's a malodor. And so this little book was to educate children and to bring a little joy. We also got to use new technology, so it's not scratch and sniff as most people think. It's layered with capsules that break as you turn the page. And so you can touch it, and kids really like to touch it, or scratch it if you're an adult and your sense of smell is waned a little bit, but you really don't have to interact with it at all. It just kind of smells. And it's an absolute joy. I have to say, of all the projects I've worked on and had the privilege to work on over my career, this little book, you should see the children. They like giggle and they laugh, and they're obsessed with it. They just want to look at it over and over and over again. So yeah, it's very special. It's a great gift for new babies. If you have any children.
We will have a chance to talk about your book. It's an exciting idea.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was great, Don. Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but I want to thank you again, our speakers and everyone, for such a rich and interesting presentations and the discussion. So the next time we're meeting next week, 3:30 UK time this time, and we'll discuss design, product design and synesthesia with Michael Haverkamp, Laden Shams and Nicholas Rothen. You're all very welcome and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you very much, everyone. See you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bye.